No problem. All right, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrina Pelton Smith. I'm the CEO and founder of the Business of Charity. We are located here in Houston, Texas, but we are fortunate to serve across the US and internationally as well. So we have helped clients from, as I like to say, Hawaii to Maryland. So we are a consultancy that focuses on working with entities that are both nonprofits and for-profits, and we provide formation services as well as capacity building, and then also grant writing. So grant writing is our core service, and we work with organizations to, if they need capacity building to be able to be grant ready, we will do that as well as set up their organization, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit. So today's focus is on human capital. This is session 4 of actually a 9-session boot camp. So you will get the first 4 of those sessions, as well as the tomorrow will focus on fundraising. And so you'll have that as a also point as well. Um, Getting started today, we're going to start first talking about why you need to have systems in place for you to make impact in your nonprofit or your small business. So, of course, human capital drives your organization, right? It's going to give you clarity in your processes. It's going to help you if you have volunteers, and most nonprofits start out with volunteers. So it's going to help you convert goodwill into services that mean that you can thrive on being just a volunteer organization. But oftentimes, usually what happens is that as you grow, you need some more sustainability. And so you begin to bring in employees. And so that is what this session is really about. We want to make sure that you have operations that align your facilities, your people, your workflow, and your resources, and then policies that obviously protect you and give consistency as the organization grows. Because as you all are probably aware, anytime a policy happens, it's usually in response to something. In this way, you will have the policies in place that will help you avoid having to create policies in crisis or after an incident has occurred. So the first thing we want to talk about are volunteers. Now, volunteers are, again, usually the lifeblood of most nonprofit organizations because they have very little cash flow to bring in employees and staff at that time. So, I want to make sure that when you're um, talking about having volunteers, you bring them in such a way that it helps them to have the mindset of an employee. So we'll talk about making sure that they have ownership over their role, that their role fits that volunteer. So you also want to make sure that your volunteer has gone through a process where they have been interviewed and then they're given clear information and clarity about the jobs and the expectations of what they will do. And then you're going to talk about sustaining meaningful engagement with them because volunteers really come on board when they are attached to your mission. Or if there is some type of need for them. So maybe they need volunteer hours, but you want them to do it well, not just come because they have to complete a process or maybe even a class, depending on the volunteer. So then we will talk about human resources. We're going to define roles of what is an employee versus a contractor. We're going to talk about recruiting well, and then onboarding consistently across the board so that those individuals will come in and understand what it is that they're supposed to do, and then be able to successfully complete that job. And then we're going to talk about in protecting employee data, because one of the key things with this is that all this has data that's attached to it. You need that data when you are attracting funders, because ultimately that's the goal of this boot camp, is that at the end of it, you have the information, you have resources, and you have templates that will help you to be able to move forward to obtain funding that will help grow and scale the organization. And then you have the operation. So you want to make sure that you have the facilities for your staff, your volunteers to work in, that there's a workflow for them, that you can actually have partnerships that form, and you have the capacity for everything that you are doing at any given time. So if any of these systems are not working well, then obviously it's going to impact your growth and your ability to be funded. So, volunteers. One of the first things that I recommend that every organization do is name a volunteer coordinator. Identify that person, give them a job description that helps them define their projects, their scope, their time, and their outcomes. And then make sure that that person takes on the responsibility to onboard new volunteers. Now, this can be a paid position, or it can be another person who is a volunteer that oversees this project. When I ran New Horizon Family Center, which is what we've talked about for the last 3 days, that particular organization had a paid volunteer coordinator. Her role was to manage volunteers, both those who came into us because they were connected to our mission and wanted to give back, and then those who were also court ordered to volunteer with us. So we had two lines of volunteers coming into the organization. And so we managed them a little differently, as could be expected, with the volunteers who were coming in because they were wanting to give back to the mission and make sure that, domestic violence and sexual assault was not something that impacted the community. They were onboarded and brought in through the process to make sure that we had an application for them, that we did a background check on them, and then we placed them in a role that we had already outlined and defined, that they were able to do consistently, but also met expectations for who and where they were. Now, sometimes it just does not happen well, where you plug a volunteer into a spot. And then you want to make sure that if that's the case, you shift them into a role that probably meets their expectations, or sometimes you have to ask them to step back. And I've had that experience. It was a very difficult one for the team because the person who was volunteering for us was well-meaning, but unfortunately did not fit into any of the places where we needed that person to fit. And so we did have to ask him to leave. The other piece of it is making sure that you're maintaining your volunteer records, because particularly for those who are court ordered in, you have to report for them. They are looking to complete their hours so that they can hopefully successfully complete their sentence or whatever has been mandated for them. So you want to make sure that your volunteer records, that you have a sign-in process for them, that once they have been, when they're on site, if you have an on-site project that you're working with them on, that they have a supervisor that they know to report to, that they know the process for if something happens outside of the scope of work that they do, that they know how to either contact a supervisor and get some instructions, or that they know how to stop where they are, leave it, and then come back through. And I say that because sometimes when you have supervisors, obviously that supervisor may not be there every day or at the time that they are there. If your process works well, our team, our clients, our rather our volunteers would come in and they knew what their project was. They would work even if that coordinator wasn't necessarily on site, but they knew the process of what they, who to contact, when to contact them, and if they were done, how to sign out. So you want to make sure that all of that data is collected and placed in a way that is obviously accessible, but also easily reportable to those that where it needs to be reported. Because even if they're not necessarily court ordered, there may be other expectations for colleges or work that may also need that data. So having that coordinator helps you to maintain that structure, as well as it gives a tone and a culture for your organization that helps them to continue to grow. And we'll talk about this more, but what are volunteers? Ultimately, they're going to become your ambassadors and potentially individual donors that we talked about that are necessary and needed to help drive revenue into the organization. So one of the closing things that we'll move to the next point is goodwill becomes capacity when organizations have expectations that are clear. So the other thing for volunteers, because they are coming into this space, usually driven by a desire to serve, or because they have a court order need to do so, you still want to make sure that you give them recognition, because that is a retention strategy. Because who knows, maybe the volunteer who was court ordered, and one of the things that we only accepted were those were charges that were not against an individual. So, no criminal activity that was obviously abusive, because we were an abuse organization. So a lot of ours were DUI cases. And so with that being the case, they might complete their volunteer service, court ordered, and then become a traditional volunteer. And so with that, we still wanted to recognize all of our volunteers. So every April, we would have a volunteer recognition program, or lunch. And so we would be able to say to them, thank you for your service, because volunteers are also a source of revenue. You can calculate the hours of work for them, and use that as part of your budget to show that we offset the cost of this project, based upon our volunteers coming in. And so that is also a way for you to show match in your budget. We talked a little bit about match yesterday. So back to recognition. Recognition is a retention strategy. So you want to make sure that you give them some type of gesture. That could be one of the things that one of the organizations that I worked with like to do was to give out every year at the end of the year, usually Starbucks cards or some type of gift card, so that way you just simply show an appreciation. Of course, certificates are great. People like to receive certificates as well. So something that's a note, a token, helps them to feel appreciated. And then you want them to make sure that they are engaged, because we talked about connecting them where they are most likely to be engaged and thrilled and feel like they are giving back. So make sure that the work that you're doing, because maybe it's not a day-to-day volunteer. A lot of my organizations had day-to-day volunteers where someone might come in and help in the office or answer phone calls. But then there may be those events where you just have them come in and do just that event. So you want to make sure that they're connected to something that engages them at the level where they are. So then when you do your larger event, and overall recognition every year, that will give them the ability to not only see where their individual contribution was meaningful, but how collectively they all came together and helped engage and impact the community through their service. So as we move forward into employees, we want to make sure that you understand, and volunteers are definitely a huge source of commitment and revenue for the organization. But sometimes you get to the point where you recognize you need to have an employee. And I had clients who had that experience where one was a safety net clinic where they were providing medical services in communities. And so the volunteers were really committed and engaged, but life, right, is happening for them as well. So when they were supposed to be there at the beginning of the day to help open the clinic, sometimes they would call out. And so that's when that particular organization recognized it's time for us to hire an employee. Now, they initially were thinking contractor, but you have to be very clear when you are engaging individuals whether the work you're requiring them to do is employer or contractor. So the IRS is giving you some very clear definitions between an employee and a contractor. And so want to make sure that that's clear. A W-2 employee, the organization controls the work. They tell you where to come, when to come, what time you will be there, whether you can take a break and how long you can take that break. And they're going to provide all the tools and resources you need to complete your job and your role. If you are controlling any of those things, time, place, and giving resources, they're a W-2 employee, and you need to go ahead and engage them in that manner. So that means, of course, you're going to pay taxes. You're going to have to make sure that if you're giving them benefits, because that's something that people are expecting in this time and place, you're giving that to them, and they are very clear about who and what role they are performing. Now, if it's a contractor, the contractor, you tell them what you want, you define the deliverable, but you will not control how they do it necessarily. You may give them a framework for how the work can be done, and even a point of time when it needs to be done, but they are otherwise in control of completing that work. And so you want to have a written agreement with the scope of work and payment terms included in that. And you want to make sure that they are operating independently and they are not staff. The IRS went through a period about 15 years ago where they really began cracking down on nonprofits and making sure that you had to find your employee or your contractor appropriately. And so that's one of the reasons why I want to make sure that you are focused on that, because it is something that the IRS has said is an issue for nonprofits. So other factors to think about, whether they're an employee or a contractor, in this case, employees, you want to make sure it's clear supervision, clear outcomes. So one of the things that we did when we onboarded employees at New Horizon, because we wanted them to understand their role in the culture of the organization as well as the work, was that we went through the grant with them. So if they were grant funded at any level, or maybe they had multiple grants, because when we're talking about budgeting, we talk about how one employee may be 50% on one grant and 50% on another grant. So we always made it clear that if they were working under a grant, that we onboarded them and then we walked through that grant with them. We walked through the expectations, the outcomes. We talked about how they were going to follow the policies, and then we gave them the tools and the resources to do that. Now, we also made sure that our data, particularly for personnel records, were appropriately kept. But we also explained to our staff how to maintain data, because there was a lot of data reporting. Obviously, we had over 10 different grants, both government and private foundation. So we wanted to make sure that we were reporting appropriately for all of those. And then we had a policies and procedures that outlined everything that they would ever need to know in terms of the workflow for our organization. And I chuckle because our policies and procedures was 127 pages and outlined everything from onboarding and volunteer management for staff, all the way out to for clients, and activities that could impact them. So we had a bomb policy, we had a weapons policy, we even had to have a whistleblower policy. So you want to make sure that your policies and procedures fit the organization, whereas our policies were for a 24-hour facility that had clients that would be there all that during that time. Other organizations, and I've now worked with other organizations to create policies and procedures that fit their narrative. So that's the other key piece. I think I talked about this a little bit on Monday. You want to make sure that when you are creating your policies, don't just go to Google or any internet search engine and pull up one and say, okay, we're done. Make sure you tailor it to fit your organization. Because the key thing is strong employees create strong workforces and environments, and strengthens your impact. So the next thing we want to talk about with contractors is your agreement with them. Now, that agreement should be in writing. And for particularly government contracts, you must have it in writing, because if they ever ask for a copy of it, that way you have it ready to go as part of your audit trail. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. So the scope should include what's included and what is not included, what must be delivered, so what's going to be produced and what is acceptable. So in what format do you want it? Is it electronic? Is it a paper copy? How are you going to give it to them? And then because the company may have some expectations, you want to make sure that all of that is incorporated into the document. It should also include the rate, the schedule, invoicing, and expenses. So how are they going to reimburse you? For instance, I worked as a contractor for a company for several years where I had a credit card through that company. And so whenever I traveled for that particular company, they would pay my hotel. And they would pay my mileage, but there was a process for both of them. There were two separate processes. And so make sure that that's outlined clearly for your contractor, so that they understand when and where they should be providing invoices and what are the terms for your deliverables. And then, of course, what's the timeline? So that same company, when I worked for them, it was every 30 days I would receive my particular assignments. I had that month to complete the assignments. There was some expectations that it would be completed before the 25th of the month. And then my reports would be completed and mailed to them no later than the 10th of the following month. But I had to then make sure that I had all my documentation done so that I could submit any invoices to them, as well as submit to them my mileage. So all of that was outlined clearly in the contract I signed with them. And then if there were any renewal terms, whether that contract was a 6-month contract, an annual contract, or if it was even a month-to-month contract, all of that should be outlined and it's clear for both parties before you sign it. And then protection, you want to make sure that the ownership of the documents is understood. Who owns them? Are they confidential? And under what level are they confidential? What happens if there's a termination? And what are your daily compliance requirements, as well as your monthly, quarterly, and annual compliance? So for instance, for this same company, every year there had to be at least one compliance meeting where all of us would come into the corporate office and we would have a meeting to go over any new updates that were happening, as well as any changes or anything that was moving forward. And sometimes we were notified if someone that had been previously in our schedule was no longer going to be included. So all of those things are important when you are looking at having a contractor who's going to work for you. Now, for both of these, whether there's an employee or whether it's a contractor, you want to make sure that you do your state and federal employment tax setup as people are getting paid. So now there are systems in place that you can use to do that. If you're using QuickBooks, we talked about that as part of the accounting system. QuickBooks also has a payroll or HR component that you can plug in and collect data from both employees as well as contractors. But then there are other programs out there such as Gusto, and what is it, Bamboo HR. So you name it, there are systems out there that you can incorporate into your process to help you make sure you are serving your employees and contractors as well. Now, you obviously are going to need some place for these individuals to work, or a corporate office, because maybe they're working remotely or virtually for you. And so therefore you don't actually need them to come into any place at any given time. But one of the things that you can do is make sure that you have a space for them when that is necessary. So for many of my nonprofits, what I recommend for them is that you have a space that fits where you are at that time. So for many of them, they're immediately like, okay, can I buy a building? Buying a building is an amazing thing to do. But what many nonprofits do not recognize is that if you're going after grant funding, because again, we're going back to looking at how you can get grants, grants do not pay mortgages, but they do pay rent. And so what I do say to clients is potentially looking at co-working space, because you can have a co-working space that will give you some flexibility as well as offer you the opportunity to have a permanent address, and a place where you can store any data or documents that need a specific place to be stored. And that is important because what you may not realize is that if you do have a grant, the funder is going to ask a question about where do you maintain your data? How do you store it? I had one particular client who went through an audit for a grant that she completed. And when that question came up, they were like, well, do you store it in a locked file cabinet? And she was, at first a little, she was like, well, it's just me. And they were like, but still, do you store it in a locked file cabinet? And I was like, we do. And so she immediately made that change because that was not something that she had ever thought about. So co-working space gives you that opportunity to maintain data in a safe place, at a lower cost than potentially going out and either fully renting a space or going out and purchasing a space. The other option is to do a collaboration with shared space. So I've seen this very often with nonprofits and churches. Matter of fact, one of the organizations that has been really successful in doing this actually partnered with a church. And the church initially gave them shared space and then eventually gave them the entire space. So now the entire building, I think it's 5,000 square feet, is now being partnered by the nonprofit and the church. I think the church still maintains one room in that building, but otherwise the building is for the use of the nonprofit. It is also a domestic violence and sexual assault agency. And so in their community, they're now a point of reference, for individuals who need in person, as well as those who are reaching out and connecting to them virtually. So that's another way that you can have a collaboration. It also serves as another revenue stream because where they would have paid $3,000 to $5,000 for this particular space, it now is given to them as an in-kind donation, and that is included in their budget as well as in their grants. And that is a resource that is something that they totally need in their particular grant that they have right now. So another great way for collaboration. And then when you are purchasing property, remember you need to make sure that you're not just looking at purchasing the property and that's it. You should have a strategy that determines what happens after you purchase it. One of the organizations that I worked with, actually New Horizon, when we started out, we were in an old, small house, literally house in the community, and we had the opportunity to build a shelter. Now, I was working for another organization while the shelter was built, but I came back as the executive director after it was purchased and recognized that part of the strategy when it was being built did not include cash flow and operation. And so there was a struggle and a strain, which actually led to the organization closing because they didn't incorporate into their process how they were going to put furniture in the building. So we went from a 4-bedroom house to now a 20-bedroom facility, 10,000 square feet, which sitting on 4 acres, which meant that the property had to be maintained internally and externally, as well as making sure we had enough money to pay for lights and water and all those different things. So when you're thinking about purchasing a property, you need to make sure you have the strategy behind it, and that the organization can continue to operate with a larger facility, because all of that means you also need to have conversations with grant funders, with donors, that they help understand your contributions are going to have to increase because our operating costs are also going to be increased. So all of this means that you need to have some type of procurement policy. And so want to make sure that we talk about procurement. Now, many organizations, if you're established, you usually have something in place, whether it's a process that's on paper or it's a process that lives in the ecosystem of the organization, you have something that gives you a reference point. But as an organization, you need to have it on paper. So one of the things that you should have is the way that you will acquire and approve the cost for any purchases. It's also part of your audit trail because you need to have documentation that shows how you decided on the purchase, the invoice for the purchase or the receipt, and then the documentation that shows that that item was actually paid for. So for your procurement process, there are several different ways to do this. You can have one for small purchases, under a certain amount, large purchases, and then capital purchases. But either way, all of them need to have something that says that you will evaluate your options. So you should determine whether there are 3 to 4 options out there and the price points for that. Once you have reviewed and decided which one is the best for you. And it doesn't have to mean that it's the cheapest option. It just means it's the best option for the organization at that time and at that price point for it. So let's say you have 3 different quotes or bids, and one is 10,000. And the other one is 15,000, but the 15,000 gives you more ability to grow and scale versus the 10,000, which is cheaper. So the $15,000 bid would probably be the best one to go versus taking the cheaper route, particularly if you have the funds, it's in your budget, and you can approve it without having to go over and above. So once you have approved it and you have the payment of it, then you're going to document all of that by putting it into a file where all of those documents should live. And whether that's electronic, whether that is physical, or both, because some organizations do electronic as a backup to their physical files. Things happen. I live in Houston. Hurricanes are a real thing, and hurricanes for New Horizon happened twice during that time. Matter of fact, one right after I became the executive director. And so literally I was moving paper files out of the shelter, which was very near the coast, into a secure location that was away from the building. So all of those things are factors you should think about. And then remember, you always have to monitor and review all of your vendors and your contractors. In fact, I forgot to mention this during your contractors, if they are supposed to have a specific level of, what's the word I'm looking for? A specific level of practice or licensing. I'm thinking about counselors because most of my organizations had counselors at some point or another. You also have to make sure that you ensure their licenses are in place and that they are active, and that you have a process to make sure that you capture that, whether it's an employee, a contractor, or a vendor. If they need a certain type of license or insurance, make sure you have that as part of your files in addition to the contract or their job description. And then we've talked about this a little bit, but I want to make sure you have job descriptions for every role, whether it's a volunteer or whether it's an employee, particularly your executive directors. I know many organizations, when I start working with them and I say, what's your job description? They're like, I'm the founder. I didn't write my own job description. That is something that is necessary and that they should do that. And then make sure you classify which roles are necessary, because it may be, again, you start out with volunteers, then move to employees or contractors. Or if you are some organizations, and I was working on a grant yesterday, one of the questions in the grant was, how many employees do you have, and then how many volunteers? So it may be a continuum of all of them. And then make sure that you have a policies and procedures, whether it's written or electronic, where people can reference it no matter what their role may be. And so remember, though, it's also a document that continues to grow with the organization. It is not static, and there may be amendments to it. And so once you amend it, you want to make sure that you share that information with those that you're working with. In fact, in New Horizon, it was required that employees after 90 days of employment had to take a test to show that they had an overall understood the policies or procedures. So One of the things that you should do in addition to that is make sure that you have an owner for your volunteer and employee systems, documentation of your roles, agreements, procurement policies, and that you are reviewing this because, again, it's not static. So any questions?
I think we're good on the questions, Katrina, but just thank you very much. That was a really good presentation.
All right. So again, if you have any questions or you would like to connect, here is my contact information. Again, this is a series. It's a 9-session series, and you just received the first 4 this week if you have participated in all 4. And if you would like to continue and complete the entire series, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to complete that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Katrina.
All right. Thank you so much.